because what we're going to look at now is forms. Let's just open this up again. React to you. So you're at a conference and you want to provide some feedback. Thankfully, the conference app has a tab within the app called Feedback. And within that Feedback tab, there are various options for how you can feedback your feedback. So at the top, we have a few text fields, right? You put in your full name, email, phone number. Then we have just sort of like a free-form feedback text area. It's kind of like what you would expect. You type, and as you keep typing, the text area will grow. It'll grow, obviously, vertically. And then maybe you want to add some emotional element to it. You feel like you're not so good at describing how you feel in words, so you want a slider to say how you feel from sad to happy. And maybe you want to flag this feedback. Maybe it's really important to be addressed right away, like, oh, you're out of coffee, and this is unbearable. What we need then is we need to know what tools are available to us to build these kinds of things and how they work in React Native. So I put together a few snack examples so you can try these out. React Native exposes, as far as I know, all of the form controls that are available on iOS and Android. So switch, slider, text input are just a few of those. There's a date picker. There's a generic sort of picker component. We're just going to look at the ones that are specific to this form that we're looking at. But all of the APIs, of course, are documented in the React Native documentation. So feel free to have a glance at that sometime. So text input is like an input with type text in the browser. There are just like a few fairly significant differences. So this text input is a controlled text input. So we set the value set to the state. When we change the text, we update the value, and then that passes it back into the text input and updates the value there. For various reasons that have been discussed already a little bit by James related to having multiple threads where you have sort of the UI thread where all the user interactions come in and content is actually rendered to the screen. And then you have the JavaScript thread where you're running your React logic. And these things happen asynchronously. So if you notice, what's happening here is, like, I press a key, that will show up in the text input, and an event will be emitted to the JavaScript thread to say the new value of this text input is H. The text input will receive that event on the JavaScript side and fire this onChangeText callback, which will set the state, that will in turn update the value for that text input, and then send back to the native side, okay, here's the current value of it. So we could do something like input value is input value plus that, for example. And it would add all that stuff to the end. But there's kind of like a brief delay, which is a little bit more noticeable just in development because rendering isn't quite as fast. There are various kinds of checks that happen, prop type checking and that sort of thing. And so you might notice that a bit. And so you kind of have to be careful in your onChangeText callbacks to not do a lot of work, right? If you're going to be doing a lot of work, then it's possible for the user to type something and your text processing to not work, and then suddenly something changes and all these text events come in and whatnot. But that's kind of difficult to explain, so I'll just show you what I mean by that. So if we set the state like this, and in our render function, well, let's see what's a good way to do that. Input value. let's do that. Actually, the easiest way to do this is to do something like let's bump that up, and we'll add something to the end of it. We'll add just a single exclamation point to the end. I'm going to get rid of this default value as well. See how there's like a delay in between when that comes up? I can add yet another 0 to make the delay longer. Right? Because this isn't being fired synchronously in response to it. It's asynchronously. So that's just something to keep in mind. Don't put a lot of heavy logic. Don't re-render very expensive things in an on-change text callback. Doesn't matter too much for this example, but that is a salient point with text inputs. Unfortunately, the styling with text inputs is a little bit different from views. And unfortunately, also, it's a little bit different between iOS and Android. It's a little bit finicky, so React Native is 2 years old, but I guess that's pretty young in technology years, so it still has some rough edges like this. One of them being, let's do that. Oops. Let's get rid of that. Notice that there's no border top. So text inputs don't support borders that are on individual edges. So you can't say border right or border left or whatever. And so a workaround for that that's pretty common, which is what we're going to use when we're doing this screen, is as you can see, there appear to be borders, and you don't want to double up on the borders. It looks weird. Is you just wrap it instead with a view and put the border on the view itself. So we just do something like down here, and press this guy. And yeah, so now we have this thing with this top border, and that works as expected. There are a lot of properties on text inputs that we should be aware of. We'll look at some specific ones when we're actually building the screen. Autofocus, you might recognize from the browser, pretty similar. But there's some things that usually you have to consider for almost every form. So keyboard type, for example, this isn't something that really comes up on the web. On the mobile web, sure, but on your desktop, you're not changing your physical keyboard when you press on a text input, whereas you have a software keyboard on mobile devices. So when you press on a phone number input, you expect a keypad with numbers to come up and a plus and an asterisk and that type of thing. So that's what the keyboard type prop is for. Max length is really useful at times because what it can do is essentially, it's, as I was explaining, the on-change behavior is asynchronous, but if you want to just like put a hard limit on it, so there is no callback to the JavaScript side. If someone tries to enter something and it's at already the maximum character length, then it just doesn't let them enter anything. What would happen otherwise is maybe if the JavaScript executes a little bit slowly, you press a letter, and then on the JavaScript side you say, hey, this is too long, remove that letter. So you see the letter kind of flash in as it appears and then is removed. And so max length is useful for that kind of thing. And then the usual kinds of things like you need to know when you blur the input. Maybe you're going to validate it when they blur or something along those lines. And of course, there's just so many things that we can't possibly cover all of them here. But another important one is return key type. So you often have different kind of like objectives of showing a form. And a really good way to not have to draw a button on your screen, but leverage the fact that the keyboard is a little bit customizable, is maybe if you're sending an email and you have a text area, change the return key type to send, and I can show you what that looks like. Right, and now you get this send button in the bottom right there. Sorry, that might be a little bit hard to see. Actually, you'll have screens there, you're fine. There are a few that are Android only, iOS only. Secure text entry, obviously important for passwords. And I think that's pretty much all we need for this particular screen. Actually, no, there was one more, which was on submit editing. So this is when you actually press the return key. You need to, you are able to handle this event in some way. A really unfortunate thing about React Native right now is that it doesn't support a tab index property. So probably everybody uses that when you build forms, so that when you click on the first name, you type something, you hit tab, you go to the email, you hit tab, go to the password, whatever, that sort of thing. So you could build an abstraction that does this for you, but there is nothing that is out of the box that will allow you to, when you press return, go from the username input, let's say, to the password input. And so we're going to look at, obviously in this form, we want that kind of behavior. So we'll look at how we can implement that. And that's the main stuff from there. Switch is another one we're going to use. So Switch is the same on both platforms. And this is generally a philosophy of React Native. If it's possible to create an abstraction for a component that works on both platforms in most cases, then build that abstraction. If there are some differences between the platform, and maybe only certain behaviors are available on one platform, but otherwise it works the same, it's kind of like additive differences, then you can create specific props that handle those differences. So if we look at the switch one, so this one has a slightly different behavior for tint color, but it's documented, sort of the differences there. And there's some more when we look at slider, some specific differences. So this is just what you would expect, right? You press on it, it does the thing. You can slide it over and whatever. So on this, there's the function's called onValueChange, and you just get whether it's set to true or false. True being on, false being off. So in our mockup, see we have a purple background, so what we need to do, we don't want to change the thumb tint color because that's the color of the grip, so that's like this actual button type thing. We want to change the on tint color, which is a fairly confusing name because most things that are prefixed with on are functions. On change, on value change, on submit editing, that kind of thing. So my eyes skipped over this the first time I saw it. I was like, okay, it's a function. Where's the other thing? So let's just change it to purple here, even though that's not really the correct color. On tint color, purple. Right? So that kind of gets us the customization we want there. So we're going to talk about, right now, a lot of APIs. So nobody's expecting anybody to memorize all these APIs. You're all developers, you're well familiar with the fact that you know no APIs and you just Google everything. But I'm just showing you that here are the things that are available, and this is more or less the idea behind them. So let's look at slider really quickly. So this is, let's see, I think it was. Right, so there are a few specific properties here that only work on some. So you can only change the tint color of the thumb on Android. You can actually change the image of the underlying track. That's the line that it runs on iOS in various ways. You can change the thumb image on iOS. So although the behavior is generally the same, you have a step, you have a maximum amount, you have a minimum amount, you have some change, and when you go like that, it drags. There are just these subtle differences in terms of what aesthetic elements you can customize between the platforms. So we got the slider, right? There we go. We're just updating some value. If we add like step equals 1 and add minimum value is 1, maximum value is 10. You can see it kind of like, it's a bit, I mean, it's hard to tell because it's in a simulator that's streamed from some computer in I don't know where over screenshots, but it's sort of like moving a little bit jerky so that it's able to lock at each of those positions. And similarly, you can change like the tint colors and whatnot. Okay, any questions about those things? Are there any other form controls that you're interested in seeing or learning something about? I can list off a few of them for you. So there's picker. That's like, you see a list of things. You pick one on iOS. That's like the little rolly kind of thing. There's a date picker on Android. There's a date picker on iOS. They work slightly differently, and that's why they're actually in separate components. So date picker Android is actually a modal. Date picker on iOS is just an inline spinny thingy. And so they use different APIs because the behavior is so different that it can't just be brought under one component. And these are things that you can look into as you need them. Sorry? So the question was, in Expo, is there a single component for the Android and iOS one, or is it different? In Expo, Expo is just everything you see in the React Native docs, plus some other APIs and things like the client app that make it possible to easily open the thing and get started and publish and that sort of thing. So it's just like React Native functionality in the core is a subset of Expo things, but we don't actually do anything at Expo to currently flatten over the platform differences between these form controls, if that makes sense. There's definitely opportunity for it. Someone could make a date picker library that opens a modal on iOS for a similar sort of behavior of what you get on Android, but it's just not there. And actually, there might even be a library like that. Okay. Yep.
On iOS, there's a send to modal menu. Does that exist in React?
Oh, like a share thing? Yeah. So not really a form thing, I guess, but there's this share dialog. So what's the API? There we go. Let's just copy this in. Let's open up. So, share. Unexpected token, got a comma, done that. So, very common functionality. Not something we're using here, but share some content like this. And there are a bunch of configuration options that you can pass into that. Again, that's all documented here. There's slightly different configuration that you can do between iOS and Android, but I'm confident that you're all able to read, so that should be fine. Okay, let's try building this thing. I have the project open here. So we're going to do something very similar to what we did before, where we're not yet into navigation, right? We can't jump between different things at runtime. What we can do is just comment something out and then make a new screen. So let's open this up. And increase the font size. And I'm going to create a new screen here. I'll call it feedback screen.js. My code installation appears to be corrupt. That's all right. That's all right. All right, so I'm just going to get this rendering nothing really quickly. Class, feedback, screen. Sorry, that's really small. Yeah, I get it. And import view text. Let's do style sheet as well. This is kind of like usual boilerplate when you create a new screen. You can create a tool to handle that for you if you want. I enjoy typing. It's therapeutic, so I'm okay with that. Schedule. Nope. Let's import feedback screen from feedback screen. I think I have this running here. Of course, I didn't render it. Feedback screen. Element type expected a string, blah, 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 blah. Feedback screen. Missed the default. Okay, you can kind of see it. It's there. Let's do. Okay, so you can see we're on the feedback screen. Hopefully we're following along to this point. Don't worry too much about following along like exactly. Just, understanding the concepts obviously is way more important than that. And all this code will be available later. Probably even a nicer version of the code because I wrote it before and not while I'm standing here sweating. So it's a good advantage to maybe have that. So I'm going to just make like a fake navigation bar thing just so we have something sort of to work with that looks similar to this. Let's create a style sheet. I think it's also just a nice exercise. We'll call this a navbar. And there are a few things to consider here. One, this is clearly a large, or long rather, screen. If we just make a view on the outside, then you're not going to be able to scroll, right? And so if you're on a small device and it extends beyond that, and we only have a view and not a scroll view, then you're not going to be able to use the app. So let's make sure that we also import a scroll view and use that on the outside. And this is also a good time to show you that we will get this error called, we're trying to lay out justify content on a scroll view. So scroll view has a couple of style properties. One is just regular style. One is the content container style. The reason for that is the scroll view itself is, it's like a wrapper around another view. And the scroll view is the thing that scrolls, and you specify like what the container size is for that. But inside of that, you have another view where the actual content goes. And so on that one, we can put justify content center, and that's fine. And the outer scroll view style is like, how big is the frame for the scroll view, right? Because the scroll view doesn't have to take up the full screen. The scroll view can be half the screen. It can be 200 pixels or 200 points tall. It could be whatever we want it to be. Here we're saying take up the full screen, but I could say like width 300, height 200 or something like that. And maybe this, right? So here the scroll view is just like, it's not the full screen, it's just part of it. Whereas the content inside of it is something entirely separate of that. So think of it more as just like a frame for a view that is scrollable. Not super important right now, but it's worth being aware of the distinction. We don't need content container style. So one interesting behavior that we want here, I think, is as we scroll, because it's like a navbar type thing, we want the content to go under that, right? And so if we put this navbar inside of a scroll view, then the navbar would just scroll with the scroll view. So let's do that first and see what that looks like. Let's put this text in here. Navbar, we can give it a height of like 65, background. I'm not going to be too strict on what I'm doing here. Title text, let's just give that. Font size, 15, color, F. Right, and see, you can already tell when I scroll, it's like moving along with it, but we don't want that. So what we need to do is make a wrapper view like this. This thing outside of it, in fact, put it there for reasons I will explain in a moment. And we're actually going to do position absolute on this. Top 0, left 0, right 0, and with a height of 65. So it's something that people usually aren't accustomed to doing on the web, of doing like top, left, right, bottom. That's a good way to actually make something just full size. You can specify all the corners of it. Here I'm saying, okay, you stretch from the top left to the top right, and you have a height of 65. Otherwise, you could do some math of like bottom is the height minus whatever until you get 65. So, all right, so we've got that. We don't really have anything in the scroll view, so I'm going to add some text and do that many times. Oh no, Vim is not very good in VS Code, sorry. VS Code, you're so good sometimes, but sometimes not. Right, so that scrolls underneath it, but you can see that it actually is rendering underneath it as well. And again, this is just an exercise. We have a navbar for in our navigation, but this is a totally common thing to do for other purposes, to have something that isn't a navigation bar, but to have some kind of overlay that serves whatever purpose, and to need to account for that size in the layout. So what you have to do in this case actually is, this is where you would actually use content container style. Set it to padding top equivalent to the size of the navbar. So you can see that it renders just under that navigation bar now. And it's important to do that rather than set that on the style itself. You could set, so first of all, you can't set padding on a scroll view, I believe. But if you were to set like, well, actually, let's try it. Oh, you can. But the difference is, although we can't see the scroll bar here, but you would see the scroll bar, if it were visible, it would show up underneath the nav bar, which just doesn't look right. And so a better alternative is to do this. Well, whatever, works. So, okay, we can get rid of all this nonsense and actually style this properly. There. Usual Flexbox kind of stuff. And one small thing that we have to do differently is just factor in the status bar. There's a constant that's exposed in Expo for this, so we can just say constants from Expo to padding top constants dot status bar height. All right, so that's more centered there. And so we can move on to the form. I'm just going to do this. So there's a status bar component, which is pretty important because, as you can see, that looks awful to have a black status bar on top of a purple nav bar. So You can use the status bar component to set the style to light content. And this is an interesting component because every screen that you put it on will, so if I'm in a navigator and let's say I tap on something here and it pushes on another screen, so I see a screen slide in, if that screen has a status bar component in it as well, then that will then take priority as the active status bar, and its properties will be applied. And then when you go back, it'll once again update from the one that's closest to essentially the front of the active stack. So we can just put it in here like this and kind of forget about it. It allows us to be declarative in how we're specifying the status bar appearance. So that's pretty similar, but let's change the color to what it should be. Purple. And change the font weight. I think you guys saw this before, but it's worth repeating again. It's kind of weird with font weight that even if it's a number, you have to make it a string. It's React Native styling quirk. You'll probably run into it at some point. So we got 18. All right, looks fine. Any questions so far? No? Yeah, it's pretty easy. Let's format that. So we need to make some text inputs. For the sake of not being super boring, I'm not going to implement the little header thing there because it's just like some text that I'm sure you all know how to format. So I'm just going to jump straight ahead to the text input. So let's do full name. So of course I need to input text input, format that, and here. And inside of the scroll view, let's add an additional padding just so we can have some space kind of at the top beforehand. And make the background color, well, let's do it in here. Background color, whatever background color we're using here. Very common styling thing is to have like a light gray background and white inputs. Okay, so it's a little bit gray. Let's add a text input now. What's going to happen? Nothing. Not there. All right. Let's give it a placeholder. Nothing. Style. Nothing. So there's some interesting stuff with how text inputs, I was saying there's like some quirks and they don't work quite exactly like views. We'll see when I'll look at this on Android as well in a moment, but you need to actually provide a height for text inputs. Otherwise, you just don't see anything. Why this quirk exists, I am not quite sure. I wish it didn't. So if you really get into React Native and find the time, that'd be cool. Submit a pull request to fix that. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Yeah, sorry, I meant to get to that. So the way that draw ordering, I guess is a good way to say it, works in React Native is it's very simple, but because of how simple it is as a rule, unfortunately, it makes some things a little more complicated to build. So what happens is that the last, essentially, this scroll view is rendered first, followed by this thing on top of it, followed by any other. So the latest sibling, the one with the highest index, let's say, is the one that has the highest Z index relative to its other siblings. And so this goes all the way back to the root. So a common way to do modals, which we'll look at tomorrow actually, is at the root of your app. With React 16, I believe it is, there's a portal type thing that lets you do that. What it does is for a modal, you'll typically render something at the root, at like the last component in your root component. So you'll have like a view wrapper, and then maybe like your app, and then you'll have like a modal window type thing. And so Z-index itself is still pretty immature with React Native. There's a lot of stuff that depends on ordering of the native views. And we saw some bugs with that recently, actually, when that wasn't factored in. So it's just usually important to keep in mind, like, if you want to render something on top of something, if you're going to absolute position a view, then the thing that it needs to be on top of, if it's a sibling, it needs to come after the sibling. If it's a child component, then as long as it's a sibling of the parent of that child component and it comes after it, that's fine. We'll look at it more tomorrow with modals, but hopefully that's like, does that kind of make sense? Or, yeah. It's like an implied set index based off of the sibling index.
It's basically the scroll view is going to run first all the time, so it doesn't matter in which order you're going to put them, or you have to put them in this order because this is the sibling of the scroll view.
Well, I'll show you what it would look like if I did this. Right, so it's positioned just absolute in the same spot. It's still there, but the scroll view is just on top of it. Yeah. So by putting it there, it's now on top. And so you can imagine it as saying, like, every sibling is assigned a Z-index that's equivalent to whatever the position is. Okay, we'll go more into, yeah?
Okay, so to his point, so the whole reason you're using the scroll view is because you might have content that's taller than the screen, so that's why you're not using Flexbox to generate the height of the scroll view and make like the view 65 and the scroll view whatever is left.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Because you want to be able to scroll under the scroll view, right? You want the content to go underneath it. So,
So the scroll view is not like a fixed height iframe. It's whatever its children are. In terms
yeah, so fixed height iframe. It's kind of like that, yeah. It's you could kind of think of it as like a fixed height iframe. It's just this iframe goes underneath this absolute position thing, and then we add some padding to the content inside of it so that it's not rendered underneath it at the top, so that it's not cut off. That makes sense. So we need to do this text input. As you can see, it looks nothing like that, so we should make it look like that. So let's just put in full name. Height, what's the height? I don't know. That's about 40. So as we saw before, in order to customize the sides of the border, we need to use a wrapper view. So I'll just call this a row. And I'll call this, very clever names, row. So the row is the wrapper view. Text input is, you know what the text input is. That's fine. Row, background color, white. Border top width. We can use style sheet.hairline width again. And border top color. We'll just make it like gray like that. Okay, so we have that on the top. Probably makes more sense to put it on the bottom, which you'll see in a second why. I mean, I don't want to belabor this too much, as it's just basic styling stuff. And then let's just add some padding. Yes, you know what, this is a bit short. Let's add some padding horizontal, which I believe Devin covered earlier, but just to reiterate, is a property that doesn't exist in the browser, but is equivalent of adding padding on the left and the right. And there's also padding vertical, margin horizontal, margin vertical. because there's no equivalent of saying like padding 1010 or something like that. So instead, there's this kind of thing, which was, it's not to say that it's not possible to create something like that. It was deemed by people who created React Native to begin with that it was undesirable. It was a confusing syntax that not many people really understood. It's just clockwise, but but it was still confusing. So, all right, add some padding to it. That's great. So all we need to do is, let's just copy and paste this thing a few times, because we need to get to the actually interesting stuff with text inputs. Okay, that kind of looks right. Full name, oops, email, and phone number. All right, only thing we need now is a border on the top of this top one so that it's nice and matched up, which I'll just do by this. So as a reminder, I believe this was covered earlier as well, if you want to apply multiple styles, you can pass it in as an array like this. So I'm saying the style is an array of styles. One is styles.row, and the other one is styles.firstRow. So first row is just going to be this, but with bottom as top. Right, yeah, looks good enough. So that's more or less what we have there, but it doesn't do like so much useful stuff. Like I press enter and the keyboard just goes away. I go to the email one and there's like no @ symbol, right? There's no whatever. So yeah, a lot of stuff that needs to be improved about it. By the way, if you're using the iOS simulator, if you press Command K when you're on a text input, it toggles the keyboard. It's usually pretty useful to have the keyboard open if you want to test these kinds of things. So, all right, so the first thing we can do is probably you don't want, like, for names, you usually don't want autocorrect. Because if you're writing your name and it's like, oh, did you mean to say, like, tortoise? Like, no, I was writing Trevor. So, yeah, that's a good one. So you can disable various properties there. Let's just open up the docs, right? Because who remembers those things? So auto-capitalize. I think this makes sense for full name. Probably want to auto-capitalize words because I believe in Europe there might be some weird exceptions where you don't capitalize everything. I don't know, probably in like Holland or something. But let's just, I mean, we could detect the region and then do that, but let's just not right now. So we'll say auto-capitalize words. Autocorrect, we do not want to autocorrect on a full name. So we disable that. It's often just useful when you're building forms to go through this list and be like, what do I need on these inputs? It's obviously editable. For keyword type, this is just a normal thing. I don't think there's really anything that we need from it. We'll look at onChange in a moment. I think the only other thing we need is return key type, because right now it just says return. I don't know, what does that mean? So let's make it next, right? Cool, next. Now you press it, nothing happens. So the way to make that work is everyone's favorite React feature, refs. This dot email input equals view. So I'm using the function ref style. There's a blog post on, I believe, the React blog on why you should do that. You can go read that. I won't explain it here, but it's definitely a good idea. And now what we can do is on submit editing. You can extract, like I said, I'm not going to build an abstraction here or anything. I'm just going to show you exactly how you can do this. So when you submit editing on this, we'll do this dot email input dot focus. So if I press something here, and press enter, it does that. We'll fix that flash in a moment. Okay, so pretty manual. Usually people build abstractions on top of that, but there's not really, as far as I know, a very solid like forms library that handles all those cases for you. So be aware. I mean, it's not that big of a deal, really, but your call. Okay, so email input, right? We just do the same thing for this one. Phone number, dot focus. That's fine. So now we should be able to just press enter and go between them. That's good. Let's fix this thing. Make that next as well. Make this one next as well. Auto capitalize. Probably don't want to auto capitalize. Oh, actually, yeah, email. Don't want to do that. Keyboard type. And this was email address. And then this last one, keyboard type, phone pad. All right, so you can go from there. Now you can see the at thingamajig comes up, and then you get this guy. And yeah, so that's the basics of how to do that. One thing to consider here is what kind of behavior do you want when the user tries to scroll while you have the keyboard open? Often, what I believe is the best behavior is if you scroll, then you dismiss the keyboard. And so you can actually do this with keyboard dismiss mode on drag. I think that's the API. Yeah. So now when you do that, right, because you want to flick and just like, it's like, go away, flick the thing, and it doesn't. Let's look at scroll view. There's this other one that I wanted to mention. Keyboard should persist taps. So this is actually, thankfully, sane by default now. On previous React Native versions, when you tap between different inputs, it would actually dismiss, it would basically not focus the other input, but dismiss the keyboard, and then you'd have to tap again. So you might see that in some older React Native apps. But this allows you to basically customize the behavior. If the keyboard's open and you tap somewhere, how should that tap be handled? And there's various options here on how to do that. So you can look into that. Okay, so we have that basic form there. The next one that's kind of important is a multi-line text input. So yeah, this thing is kind of not as easy as in the browser, where in the browser you just have a text area, right? Text area or like a div, content editable, which for basic stuff is like, it works pretty well. But that's not totally the case here. Let's see. Okay, so I have this component that is set up here called growing text input. And there are a few things to note about it first before we even use it. First, it proxies all of these useful methods from text input onto the underlying text input, because this is a composite component. And so I want to say, okay, if you call focus on it, we should still do what you expect with focus. If you call clear, it should still do that. Measure is something that we will get into probably tomorrow if there's time. But ultimately what happens here is we get this event called on content size change. And what that does is it gives us the size of the content inside of this text input. So there are two sort of sizes there, right? There's the container of the text input itself. You can scroll that container. It doesn't have to be the size of all of the content. But if you want to grow the text input as the content size grows and grow up until an infinite amount until the user stops typing, then you need to adjust the height as people type. So here I'm typing, and then I go to the next line. So the content size height at this point has grown because there's 2 lines. So maybe it was 30 points before, now it's 60, whatever. And so this callback fires, and it updates the height. So it's useful to just pull that into a component like this because there isn't one in the core. The core is intentionally made to be fairly small in order to make it so there's, I guess, less issues on it to manage, and also so that other projects can iterate outside of the core more quickly without having to go through the whole review process that is required as soon as any code is going to be accepted to land in Facebook's apps. So a quick aside there, any code that's on master on the React Native repo is automatically pulled into all the Facebook apps that use React Native. And so that can sometimes hurt the speed of getting new code into React Native itself because, of course, it has to, I mean, the pros and cons to it has to pass all their internal tests, has to be something that they're willing to add because it could increase the size of their applications. And so often it's better to keep things that are not these primitives that are required to build other features and whatnot on top of it outside of the core and in external libraries. That said, this should probably be in the core, but whatever. So this thing, you could just see it. It's on react.eu.xyz and pull it into a project. I'm going to pull it in here. Let's open this up. And I think once we do this, unless anyone has more questions about forms, I don't think I'll bother creating those sliders in this form because we just looked at it in Snack, and I think everyone was like, that's good, that's fine. So unless anyone objects to that, let's do a quick vote. Move on to navigation after multi-line text input, yay? Okay, that's most people, yeah. And I'm just going to plop that in there. Then we can go back to the feedback screen, import that guy. Growing text input from, where is this thing? That's in screens. Components. All right, let's just drop that in here. Oops. It's a row. And growing text input. And we'll set a minimum height on it of, I don't know, like 80 or something like that. And placeholder, we had some text. This thing. Don't need that. Don't need that. We'll get rid of that. Phone number. This is feedback input. And once again, on submit editing, this phone number, feedback, input, focus. All right, so we have some stuff there. As we type here, it grows. Let's just set some actual styles for this. We'll call this one growing text input, because we don't want to limit it to the height of 45 like the other. Sorry?
Can you share out the code?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Oh, is there some Slack stuff? A little copy of the feedback forms, please. Yep, 1 second. This was called growing text input. And I misspelled that. All right, looks pretty good, I guess. Change font size on it if we want as well. But yeah, that's basically that aspect of forms. You saw the other controls, so like I said, Won't really go into that. I can copy and paste this code out into here. Again, better version of this code I will share at the end of the day in a completed example. So, you know, do your thing. Oh, it's not Java. It's JavaScript/JSON. Come on. I don't know what our break schedule is supposed to look like, but I wouldn't mind a coffee. Do people want to get a... Am I allowed to do that? Yeah? Can I have permission for that, Adam? Yeah. Okay, let's get coffee and take a break. It's good to also add blur on submit equals false on these inputs if you plan on jumping to another one, because, oh my God, so many emulators. Remember when I was pressing next and then the keyboard would like go down a little bit and come back up? So we can simulate that again by removing this property. Of course I can't because of that. Kind of hard to reproduce sometimes. Anyways, it's hard to reproduce without doing, actually, I want to show you, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to do the, right, so see how it like goes away like that, goes down? It's not really desirable, so if I set blur on submit to false, then it doesn't matter that it takes half a second for it to actually say focus the next one. It still works without hiding that a bit. So that's a useful property when you're doing something like tab index.